The costs finding it before it became an issue were millions of dollars of saving over after emergency.
Welcome to another episode of the Unmanned Podcast powered by USI. Today we sit down with Scott Lashmit, the UAS Aviation Manager for Cyberhawk. Founded in 2008, Cyberhawk is the very first company in the world to use drones to inspect industrial assets, having completed over 500,000 inspections for 300 customers over 40 countries. They have definitely been on the forefront of scaled operations. And in this episode, we get to learn about how drones have 10x returns for those utility industries. We also briefly discuss training and how proficiency enhances safety. And finally, we'll quickly visit Scott and I's shared opinion on the worst baseball team in the Major League Baseball. And can you guess who that is? I'm excited to tell you. Let's go. Hey, Scott, how are you doing today? Nice to see you.
Hey, it's great seeing you again.
Where are you located at? Where are you at?
I am in our offices, our new offices, as of about a month ago in Golden, Colorado.
Well, for our listeners, you're working right now at Cyberhawk. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what Cyberhawk does and what you're doing at Cyberhawk? You know, it's a great company, and I'm super excited for our listeners to hear a bit about it.
It's an interesting company. It's actually, globally, we are a Scottish company. It started in 2008. So really in the nascent phase of drone operations across the world. And it was a group of offshore oil rig rope climbers dangling underneath the deck in the middle of the North Sea going, man, there has got to be a better way to do this. And so they started playing with drones. I think those might have been Intel Falcon 8s in the beginning. And very quickly they realized that they were onto something. And now we have grown to, like I said, I think just over 250 employees globally. We have three main hubs. We have our Denver office, which again is in Golden. We have what we lovingly call the West Sac Drone Shack, which is where a lot of our California operations and equipment are based out of. We have our office in Ratho, which is just north of Edinburgh, Scotland. And then our other major one is actually in Doha, Qatar. We do a lot of oil
interesting
out there. We still do both onshore and offshore oil and gas, but have expanded. We have LiDAR and mapping services, but our bread and butter really is out in California, close visual inspection of transmission and distribution and substation assets for the large energy providers out there as a part of their wildfire mitigation programs. So we just had our first over 1,000 flights in a single day just the other week, and we have continued to grow and are trending in the right direction to continue to grow.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you've also done some consulting on the side. What kind of items are you working on, or projects do you work on?
Yeah. So I'll go into my well-rehearsed 2-minute about me. So I graduated in 2008 with a degree in molecular biology and was lucky enough to have worked in a lab for 2 years while in college. And it dawned on me that I didn't have the right personality type to do that. My heart goes out to anybody who can, but 12-hour days without talking to people, sample in, sample out is it's not, as you can tell, my personality. So I actually ended up, I describe it as falling into teaching. I taught high school science for 8 years.
Oh, cool.
I still hold 2 licenses to teach biology and chemistry in Massachusetts. And it was actually students in the science club in 2012 who first got me into drones. And I was bit by the drone bug immediately. We started with little Hubsan X4, $30 off of Amazon drone. And it's still actually, that's what I recommend for anybody who's like, hey, how do I get into this? I tell them, get one of those $30 ones indoors and start flying it. Because if you can fly one of those that has no stabilization and has no aids, when you step up to a larger ecosystem like the DJIs or the Sci-Flies or the Skydios out there that have GPS stabilization and obstacle avoidance, you'll realize that you are an ace pilot and you have all of those systems there.
Yeah, for sure.
So 2016, I had Phantoms and Inspires, and I had about 5 different larger drones. And my wife kind of looked at me and said, okay, like this is becoming an expensive hobby. Do you plan on doing something with it? And so I took the leap. And I left teaching in 2016. And I remember the conversation with my father-in-law going, I think I can make a career out of this drone stuff. And looking back almost 10 years later, I did. I started out with my own service company, did real estate, and got into 3D photogrammetry, which led to a career. Was privileged enough to be part of American Tower's drone program, then moved on to managing the drone program for NL Green Power for North America, and then moved into government, so working with the Massachusetts Department of Transportation's UAS program as a complex UAS operations manager, dealing with rules, regulations, compliance, and the FAA and waivers. And then 2 years ago, actually went out to AVSI Exponential in Denver, and very atypical for both my wife and I just kind of said, "Hey, we could live here." And my sister-in-law was in Edgewater at the time, and man, that hit home. A week and a half later, we had our house on the market, and it sold in a day. And was lucky enough to bump into somebody who knew Chris Fleming at Cyberhawk. And it's I told this story at Commercial UAV Expo. My story is this story of serendipity and divine intervention or sheer dumb luck of finding somebody who knows the CEO of
Yeah.
Cyberhawk. And Chris's version is basically like, yeah, my friend called me and said she met somebody who flies drones and is in culinary school right now, which I was, passion project. But he took the call, and about an hour and a half in, he goes, "I'd like you to interview for the aviation manager role." And I've been there coming up on 2 years now.
Nice.
So I deal, FAA and compliance. So within the first month, we had our first BB loss waiver applied for and received it short 90 days later. And then this year, we've received a rather permissive long linear beyond visual line of sight waiver
Yeah.
with fixed wing VTOL drones.
No,
Uh,
and that's awesome, and I do want to talk about that because it's a super interesting use case, and I think like in today's episode, what we want to get to is those real world impacts that you're talking about, because the fire mitigation piece, obviously, they learned from getting some black eyes with regard to power distribution and starting fires. That's super unfortunate, but now we have these tools and technology that can be forecasted and used proactively as opposed to reactively when I see something um, in the energy grid, an issue, let's go look at it. Like they're not waiting anymore, they're proactively looking and reviewing this. So I want to talk about that a little bit. I'll talk about what they're doing over there and how the mitigation works. What we'll also talk about for our audience is kind of how that return on investment works, and how they're saving money by even flying more, like auditing more often, but you're still saving money, which is an amazing ROI discussion. And then, like we said, to unpack that BB loss discussion that you just kind of alluded to. So we're really excited about talking all this. So first, I guess, let's talk about what your clients are actively solving for with drones right now. What are they doing, and what's like the strongest and repeatable return on investment utilizing drone technology that you see?
the wonderful thing about drones is that there's not a ton of novel things they do. There are certainly some novel use cases out there, but the majority of them are expediting methodologies of ground-based inspections. And so, to your point, the ROI is absolutely there for especially these large-scale electrical grid. What's the proper term for them? Owners, operators, but also for there's tens of thousands of smaller co-ops out there. And while they might not have millions of dollars to throw at starting up a UAS program or subcontracting, the value is absolutely there from that first flight. The way that I always look at it is compared to the status quo. What are they doing today? Which is a guy in a truck driving along with a cell phone usually. And so for these transmission towers or distribution tower inspections, you're already a step above by the mere fact that you're flying above the asset and giving them a viewpoint that they can only get by climbing it and putting at somebody in danger of electrocution or harm from a fall. And so, right there, immediately, there is ROI from a safety aspect. You are putting people less in harm's way. And the 10x where you really get that is when you start finding things. It fascinated me. My time in Enel, we found a cross member on a single point of failure line coming out of a production facility. And the costs finding it before it became an issue were millions of dollars of saving over after emergency of loss of service, the emergency repairs, and hit to reputation, things like that. And so for these larger programs, yeah, they find that, and it is funny to see, there's a balance, because if you found an issue, now you know about it, you need to take care of it. But at scale, we find issues, and if it's severe enough, we'll report them right away. And they love getting those, because that is one less possible incident, that is, litigation that's been saved, it's emergency saved, and God forbid, it could be a life saved as well.
And they're keeping their customers happy because they have a healthy grid or healthy power system, and they're not having brownouts, blackouts, whatever. Yeah,
As the conversation usually goes, it beats the heck out of a helicopter flying right over their house.
yeah.
Once I say that, people are all like, "Oh yeah, please go fly that drone. Go fly it, like as much as you need." You also get, a level of detail that just increases the ability for good decision making. And something at Cyberhawk that we pride ourselves on is the speed to decision, because that matters. If it takes you a week to deliver the data, that is a week of time in which they are not informed to make a decision. If you're getting that down to, hey, next day you have this deliverable, and again, in emergency situations, even if we're not inspecting that particular asset, if we drive by something and we see something, we'll call it in right away. And not charge anything because we're not flying it, but say like, hey, like that looks like a conductor has come out, or there's a cotter pin missing or something. And there's just huge values all around kind of the value tree of, yes, OpEx is probably the largest value saving. If you can preventative maintenance is I don't know what the number is, but it's worth a lot better than post incident maintenance.
It's also using the maintenance assets correctly too, because before you kind of either waited until something broke or you had evidence in some other type of measurement capability. But a lot of times you might be doing maintenance unnecessarily, where now you're doing it a little more efficiently, yeah, and staying in front of that game.
That's a huge, actually, I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's a huge other aspect to it, which is, I talk a lot about, oh, hey, we're finding these issues before they happen. But going to an asset that they don't have to replace when they had it scheduled replaced saves them
Yeah.
tons of money as well. So just having a better picture of the condition of the assets, again, informs them and allows them to make better decisions, which hits their top of line, but also their bottom line.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think most of our viewers will appreciate the fact that where a person can do 3 or 4 inspections, a drone can do 10. And then what it means, it doesn't mean that you're doing less work from the perspective of a person. You just have the capability now to do more proactive looking, more. You're actually expanding that schedule and being able to look at more of your infrastructure quicker, and it's just an enhancement all the way around. And we've talked about that a few times on the podcast. And to me, it's almost a no brainer. It just makes sense.
It's double-edged sword. There's a scalability thing, which I mentioned. Drones accelerate what they're doing today, and so it's fantastic to have this view where, to your point, yeah, a ground-based inspection, they might get 10 inspections done a day. We have pilots who are capable of doing hundreds of inspections in a day. And again, that data can now go to a qualified OLI, an overhead line inspector, who can inspect more assets than they could by going out in the field. And they get to do it from the comfort of an air-conditioned office instead of being, 40, 50 feet up in the air looking at it near, charged energy lines.
And that's one more safety enhancement too. I mean, a lot of times these line technicians might be single pilot, if you in the truck, you know what I mean, and then expose themselves into elements. Now they're back in the base, and you can have drone in the box or some other types of solutions. So that's removing them from those environments that could be dangerous to their health as well. What sectors are you seeing adoption the quickest? Is it this energy segment? I know you're also working with pipelines and offshore rigs. Where do you see the most activity?
I think the number one adopter over the past decade has been the utility sector. Whether that is oil and gas as well, or just electrical generation and transmission and distribution. The earliest adopters really saw, hey, if I can get a better handle on the condition of my assets, I can do preventative maintenance. And again, they're looking at OpEx. It's not atypical to see 10x or more returns on that. For every pole you don't have to replace, you save thousands of dollars, if not tens or hundreds of thousands. For every fire you prevent by doing maintenance on something that might happen. You could save billions of dollars, and again, opportunity cost or litigation. I think we're also seeing some markets who kind of shied away at the beginning from UAS or drone operations starting to circle back because they're seeing, ag is a huge one. Precision agriculture has grown over the last couple of years, and that I think is going to be a large up and coming. Oil and gas, like I said, I've got the picture here that is actually an offshore Cyberhawk picture from years ago. Let's zoom in on the photo there, see if it's a 350 or an Intel. But so we'll go still do that. And, asset inspections, there's OGI inspections, where you've got methane detection sensors, and you can do some really cool things about, almost four-dimensional mapping of the off gases if there are, and you can see and combine that with weather data, you can actually get a realistic picture over time of, what's happening there. Steel structure analysis as well. They've got, there's tons of companies out there with non-destructive UT testing now, ultrasonic thickness testing.
From a drone?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
See, this is what I was going to ask you too, is like, what kind of surprising use cases have you seen? That's one I haven't thought of that with that capability. One I heard recently too was they use drones to blow dust
Mm-hmm.
and off of like the high rafters where a person used to have to climb up
Yeah.
and literally sweep the dust off because you got to keep a low dust environment in some of these factories and some of these. So they now use drones to just
I love
blow
it.
that dust down. Yeah. And so
Hey,
it's
look,
just,
I will admit, just for fun, I will use a drone to blow the leaves around out of my gutters and on my lawn, but I never thought anybody was using it commercially. So that's fantastic. And I think, we're 2016 and Part 107 as really the nascent phase of true at scale drone operations. And we're coming up on a decade. We've got the Part 108 NPRM that's kind of dangling out there, and public comment period closes, I believe, on Monday. But to see the use cases that we haven't even thought of, and that's a low hanging fruit in terms of technology. You can get any drone that can do that. But now, to that company, well, an outsider's like, oh, you're flying a drone to blow the dust off. That is scaffolding costs. That is fall from height safety. Like, there are so many ancillary things that add up there where, I'm excited to see kind of, now that we're an established field and, it's less, it took a long time for people to move away from the concept of drones as a toy to drones as a tool. And I think that's where we're at right now. And I'm excited to see over the next, 5 to 10 years, what else?
and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier too. You can do it more often and it costs you less money. I mean, whereas before you had to build some type of erect a scaffolding to get up there and clean, you're only going to do that once a quarter, and it accumulates to what you've said is enough or safe enough, and then you clean it once a quarter. Now you can clean it every month, and it's still
Yeah,
cheaper.
yeah.
And
Is
you're
one of the
safer.
frequency of use usually goes up,
Yeah.
even if it adds some cost that, they weren't expecting the traditional way. I mean, the scaffolding one there, if you can save on scaffolding, that drone program pays for itself.
For sure. Yeah,
Uh,
it's like 10K to build a scaffolding in some cases for
and that's the
foundational.
get
Yeah.
one off an entire building, and all of a sudden you're
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And if you can replace that by using a drone to either map it, or that UT,
Yeah.
we use. I guess I'll wrap a little bit. There are several companies out there. There's Valero's. We have a Flyabilities Elios 3 that has a SLAM LiDAR built on it and the UT sensor. And so not only are you getting accurate UT measurements, but they're repeatable because you have
Mhm.
that 3D model being built live for the simultaneous location and mapping. You can, one, the battery life, and they've just doubled their battery life a few months ago. But you can stop the inspection, switch the battery out in confined space. I mean, that's one of the beautiful things about that. We do a lot of
Yeah.
operations where it's either you're putting somebody in a very dangerous confined space situation in which, they need special training and special gear, or you can send this drone in. And, I always frame it this way to my pilots. I'm like, look, if the drone goes down, the drone goes down. That is infinitely less expensive than the loss of somebody's life.
Yeah.
Obviously we try to avoid it. We train them to operate as a professional operator, but sometimes things happen, and I can justify, hey, we put that drone down. Okay, hey, we carry insurance for that. But again, that's significantly better in those confined space ones than sending somebody in there and having risk.
Oh, for sure. Moving on, I think we can, all agree drones in general are money savers, if you would, and in a vast amount of ways. But there are some bottlenecks to using drones in the world, and you kind of briefly touched on 107 and where we're at today. What is your experience with some bottlenecks, some challenges in deploying drone technology in some of these use cases that we've talked about?
2 years in drone technology, or really any technology, is a lifetime. And so obstacle avoidance is getting better and better. I think a lot of what holds us back is the regulatory system. But I also fully understand the crawl, walk, run approach. So I understand why, it started out with Section 333 exemptions, or 44807s that came after that. And now we have 107 and, looking towards 108. And I always have to level set expectations and go like, look, it's not a magic bullet. They're operating from a safety aspect and figuring out, okay, stepwise, what are we comfortable with? I think, the biggest hurdles that a lot of smaller companies have run into is beyond visual line of sight versus visual line of sight. Um, and I think the other largest ones are probably operations over people or moving vehicles, because these are the two most restrictive in terms of how can I operate compliantly with the law. The visual line of sight is what it is. For a lot of operations, that's perfectly fine. We hold multiple beyond visual line of sight waivers. Our close visual inspections, we almost never use them because most of the time we're close to the asset. And so, we do hold it, and we can do 50-foot shielded, or on the pipelines, right of way inspections, we can go 250 feet above structure. For a lot of it, it's not necessary. But once you start to grow to a scale, if you're not just doing the photos of one home, but you want to map an entire neighborhood, well, now keeping the line of sight on the drone is cost prohibitive if you need more people in the operation. And that's where, they smartly created the waiver and exemption process to be able to allow it. And with those, what you're trying to do is make your safety case and say that I am not causing undue harm to the national airspace because of how I operate. And there's a lot of different solutions. I'm a super nerd at this. Every time there's a new 107, I go in and I look, and well, they don't share the concept of operations with you because those are proprietary. You do see what the FAA, kind of the level that they are saying, hey, okay, this is where we're comfortable. And, we've seen it on all of the waivable parts of 107. That's the one. Not everything's waivable. You can't get ADAC out through 107. You need a 44807. BV loss, you can, limited visibility, high altitude. These are things where, especially from the mapping perspective, 400 feet is the standard because there's typically a 100-foot separation from general aviation. And so the FAA looks at that and says, okay, hey, most of the time, unless you're close to an airport, there's not going to be a lot. Again, it's not a 0% chance. You've got crop dusters and people who are legally allowed to be there, but it's lower risk. But for mapping, there's a GSD balance and time to collect balance and battery life balance optimization that you're trying to run, which is, for a really good sensor, say you've got a phase 1 P3 100 megapixel sensor, I want to fly as high as I can because I'm capturing as much as possible. And I know that I can go enhance, and zoom in. But if you're operating 1,000 feet, your risk has scaled up significantly with conflicts of general aviation, but also now other unmanned aviation as well. And so it's a matter of putting a safety case and figuring out how can you operate compliantly in a way that works for your business.
Another resource that isn't tapped very often is your FAA friends. Like, people look at it and, oh, I'm not going to talk to the FAA, but you should be having weekly meetings with them as you're developing these safety concepts and the safety ops, because they're going to help you. They're here to help get you to across the finish line. They're not some folks look at them as blockades, and I don't think they are in most cases. If you have a sensible rep, they will help you. So
They get a bad rap because they're part of the government and they're regulatory. So people look at them as a handbrake, as often safety is. And I don't view it that way. I look at what I do and regulations and safety as a means to get to a yes safely. And I wholeheartedly agree. Like they're people, and they're really good people, and they genuinely have a vested interest in UAS operations. But they have bosses too that they need to justify their decisions to. Weekly is probably a little tough because they got a lot of time, but they will reach out to your local FISDO. Reach out to if you're looking for permission to fly in classed airspace, reach out to the ATC first. Make yourself a known entity. Make them aware. That process, when you're filing through Drone Zone, it goes to a local FISDO who reaches out to the ATC. And my experience has always been if the ATC is already aware that you're going to make the ask, it makes it smoother and it expedites. And look, don't be afraid to make mistakes. The only times I have ever seen them outright deny a waiver or a COA application is if you didn't do the work. If you put in three sentences and were like, let me fly BVLOS. Well, they're going to be like, there's no justification, there's no safety case. But as long as you're not going to get it perfect the first time. Look, I've been doing this for a decade, and I still go back and question myself: do I want to word it this way? Should, would, shall, could are words I spend way too much time, but they matter. Words matter,
Yeah.
and what you get from there's what you ask for in your waiver and your con ops, and then there's what you're given, and that's the more important one because that's what you have to technically comply with. But the FAA they do look at these as partnerships. So, again, don't just throw a couple sentences, but if you go through and you're missing some things, they will do an RFI, or request for information, and say, hey, this is great. You didn't answer any of these things from the waiver safety explanation guidelines or the WSEG, which they have. That's all public information. So you can, again, if you're nerdy like me, you can go through and see what people have gotten. You can pull down these questions because that is the checklist the FAA is going through. So they're being as transparent as possible with, hey, here are the questions we've got to get answered before we can get to a yes. But know that, yeah, they look at it as a partnership.
And it's just like anything the FAA does. They're not trying to surprise you. I mean, they may inspect you, but the inspection checklist is available. Like you can download it and look at it, and you should be familiar with it because you're supposed to be doing those things anyways. So for the operators watching, if you're curious about what is inspectable, kind of what Scott's saying is there's resources out there that the FAA has available to everybody. What would you also comment towards those watching, Scott? That what kind of compliance partnership or parts and pieces should they have? I mean, SOPs, a GOM. I mean, I know it's dependent on the size and scope of your business, but I mean, what are your best practices you got?
Nobody's going to take you seriously unless you take yourself seriously. So even if you are a single person, yes, write an operations manual. Yes, have standard operating practices every time you have a new kind of thing you're doing. And find your niche. Like one of the biggest mistakes I made at the beginning was very quickly scope creep, saying like, hey, I can do all of these things. Well, could I do them? Yes. Was I an expert? No. And so some of that is just tough lessons learned of, hey, here's what I excel at. But my suggestion is write it down. Look, the secret to scalability is not really a secret. It is process and procedure. You write down how you do what you do, and that might be different than how another operator operates. That's totally fine. But if you write it down and you get to the point, where you're getting these contracts and now you need to hire or contract pilots, if you have it written down, it's easy to train them on and say, boom, here is, I always say this, here is the Cyberhawk way to fly. Look, I love it if you have 1,000 hours, but I could take a kid who's got 1,000 hours in Call of Duty and train them to fly a drone commercially, because that mode 2, that thumb-eye coordination, I go to my parents all the time and go, you told me this would never do anything.
Yeah. Now look at me now.
It's one of those things where I mean it, you have to take yourself seriously. And part of that is documenting what you do. And, it might, if you're just by yourself, it might seem silly, but what you need to think in your head is not where you are right now, but where will I be in 2 to 3 years? Like, do I want to grow to a point where I have multi-year, multi-million-dollar contracts? They're going to want operations manuals. They're going to want SOPs. They're going to want safety and compliance. There's always the balance with costs, and I get it. Be as cheap as possible. There are ways to do this, just with Google Suites and docs like that.
I love it, but you just made one comment there. Yeah, you want to be frugal, but you don't want to. You want to be professional, kind of like you're saying. There's a balance there, and I think it's important to look at it from the perspective of we've said it probably 100 times in just this short conversation we had: safety. And that's really what's driving everything. The rules, the capabilities, the exemptions you get, all of those are based off of safety decisions. And so if you're creating these documents, yes, be frugal and think about that, how much, because time is money, and you're going to devote some time and dedicate time developing these, but you want to make them so they're meeting a safety bar, because that's really what it's coming down to, and you've said it multiple times. Pivoting real quickly too, because you also talked about training, and I know the new 108 rule, and there's a bunch of comments already in there, 700 plus, but I know the new 108 rule kind of adds a bit of context to the training requirements for permitted and certificated operations. What's your thoughts there? What's your experience with training? Because you just said I can train anybody. So how are we feeling about this in the 108 training requirements?
The first thing you have to do is look at it through a lens of, this didn't come from nowhere. We had the ARC BVLOS, or the BVLOS ARC, flip those around, years ago. And almost all of this is based on the existing safety cases made through the 107 waiver process, which is people have come and said, here is how I can do this safely. And so, one of the things missing from 107 really was a standardization for some of these things. And training is a huge one. This is the teacher in me coming out, but I wholeheartedly believe, training and practical training are probably the most important. The role of the pilot has shifted over the last decade and has continued to shift as we start to move towards more autonomy and automation, which is what 108 is predicated on. And so the training, I'll say this: you don't have to be a duly licensed educator to get this done, but also know you don't have to do it yourself. There are wonderful companies out there. Case in point, the gentleman I'm speaking with today, USI has a wonderful program, and we're starting to see what's really been missing over the last 10 years, which is a pathway from, okay, hey, I want to fly drones, to becoming a certificated or permitted under 108 operator, or even under 107. And how do I get from, okay, this is cool and I'd like to try this out, to now I have the confidence that I can fly safely. And look, every time I fly, and I've got hundreds of hours BVLOS, my heart doesn't beat until I am done with that flight. And I don't think I'll ever lose that. But that's just the safety mind of knowing, like, anything can happen. I do differentiate between shielded, where I'm, maybe 100 feet away and I've got obstructions in the way, from, 50 miles away, where there's nothing I can do. And I am now, it's a lot like just depending on sensors and flying in manned, right? VFR versus IFR, you have to trust the systems that you have there. And I think training is a huge part of that. It's one of those, the old saying of, like, tell me and I'll forget, and show me and I'll learn, but let me do it. Or, yeah, I messed it up, but let me do and I'll actually learn it. And I think that's one, my recommendation to you, if you're a small operator, if you're a large operator, get time on the sticks. Even if it's manual flight, awesome, because that's, the RPIC is always there for that emergency situation in which your GPS stabilization goes out. But, start messing around with mapping, start messing around with some of the softwares, take a look at UGCS, take a look at what's there. You might find, community colleges and things are starting, even high schools, which I love, are starting to get funding for STEM programs. I wrote a curriculum and taught it in Framingham, Massachusetts. And, I actually had 2 sections of that class and had to turn kids away. And they all came out with the skills to fly, but also the knowledge necessary to pass a 107. And I think figuring out your partner there is probably the most important, because it is. Look, I remember the first time I flew, and I went and, oh man, I paid for an in-person class, which I was so happy with. And it gave me the confidence. And I remember speaking with the instructor, and, I was 30 years old at the time. I'd been flying drones for years, but, that step up to commercial operation was scary to me. And I had the conversation, and I was like, well, I've got, hundreds of hours flying these smaller ones and even a Phantom. And he just kind of looked and he goes, you're probably going to be the best pilot here, because a lot of them have never flown a drone. But he's like, yeah, these have stabilization and things. So you have all the skills there at the base level. And now you've got this automation and autonomy built on top of it, and collision avoidance. And really, 30 minutes of flying there, I was like, okay, Okay, no, I can do this.
Yeah.
I think
You
another
know,
note. Yeah, go ahead.
go no, continue. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna go back to the pathway, which is something, especially at Cyberhawk. We have some things with USI in the works. We have some things with Fullerton, where really what we need is that pathway to get pilots. 107 is great, but it doesn't actually mean you can fly the drone.
That's right.
Uh,
That's right. Yeah.
and I look at that as, look, I can't even consider you without it. It's your barrier to entry into the industry. But really, what I care about is giving you the practical skills and spending time flying on assets. I always do crawl, walk, run. So the first one is fly, where you can't hit anything. Then move up to a mock asset. When I'm testing new softwares and things, I go open field where I'm not going to cause any damage, a wooden pole with nothing on it, then maybe a light pole, and then I might work up to an actual asset that has charged or energized lines on it. But a lot of it is just getting that confidence, and that's where I think looking for a partner like USI is hugely important. People who've just been there, and I've personally experienced. We had a wonderful time with Cameron doing fixed wing BB loss training, and that is flying a moto. Oh my god, here flying a quadcopter. There we go. Is kind of here, which is great. Stepping up to beyond visual line of sight operations is a whole other set where you again need to build up that confidence that you can trust these systems, you can fly them for miles, and just having somebody there to who already has the confidence is huge.
Well, I like that you say that too, because I think there's this common or this generalization nowadays, and it's starting to creep in there where the autonomy is going to take over for everything, and I do think there will be some point like that, like a nuclear reactor runs on its own. No one's turning, knobs and handles like in the olden days, but they are trained and educated on knobs and handles. So they have a familiarization into what you're talking about, a comfort with the technical side of the house, and and they're managing the autonomy. And the same thing will take place in the aviation world, but I feel like there's still the need for the hands-on component to give you the air sense needed to understand the overall picture, especially if you have one to many operations going on. So there's going to be a balance there. And I think, yes, maybe 10 years, 15 years down the road, we'll figure out some way to train folks who have never, ever flown a drone by hand. And they will still be a safe RPIC or manager. But I don't think we're there yet with the autonomy that we have available. And I think we'll have to grow there. So comment on that, and then from that also tell me what your 2 or 5 year horizon looks like. What are you seeing ahead with regard to either technology or policies? Kind of read your crystal ball for our audience.
Yeah, so I agree. Look, I just had to have this conversation with my senior leadership team to be like, look, 107 is not going away. 108 is predicated on pivoting towards organizational structure, but it again leans heavily on automation and when we get their autonomy. So I actually think, while I have some comments, overall it's a pretty good framework to grow over the next 5 to 10 years. I agree. There are some automation solutions out there, and there are some autonomous solutions out there. I have looked at a bunch of them. I've yet to find a perfect solution that can fly a distro pole with trees coming everywhere and comms line there. I think, to your point, I think we will get there. That DJI M400 with millimeter wave radar and things like that. I think technology is there. It's just, it's a cost thing too. It's integrating that. But there will always be a need for, the 107 manual pilots. And maybe again, I say always, but maybe again in 20 years with technology growth, everybody's kind of shifted to the 108 model, which is less mode 2 intervention and more kind of looking at a screen, almost like a drone air traffic controller, giving it to go to this waypoint, initiate emergency procedures. And we've already seen over the past decade, smart return to home and things like that. It used to be you'd go up to an altitude and it would beeline home. Heck, before that, you didn't even have a return to home option. Now you've got multiple systems who will follow the path that they flew back because they know that's a safe path, as opposed to, if you have a COA and you're flying in airspace, if that thing goes beeline back to where you are, you may have just violated your COA because it's an emergency situation, but it beelined back to you. I think, as with all things, there are going to be certain industries in which the automation and autonomy is easier to accomplish. Mapping and things like that, where you're 200 to 400 feet AGL and there really isn't anything in the way, are easier from a planning perspective to automate and repeat, which I think is another huge value of drones is, construction management, for example. If you do the work once and you go back there every week, it's a matter of pulling up the same exact flight plan and flying, still doing your dynamic risk assessment, right? You always have to check, oh, hey, they put a crane.
Yeah.
They put a crane up.
And for our audience who might not be aware, there was a
Yes.
incident with drones and a crane
Yes.
yesterday.
Um,
Thanks,
yeah.
Scott.
I think, it'll continue to grow. I think 108's, again, there are certain things in there, there's a section about removing waivers from 107, and I'm just hard against that. I think spirit of it is to lighten the load on the FAA. But, again, for our close visual inspections, we are not qualified for 108 because they are all manual flights. Now, maybe someday I will get to a nice, perfect autonomous system where, drone in a box is great. Drone in a box in a truck is a whole other thing where you can just have a technician, doesn't even need a 107 or a 108, certification, or I guess doesn't need to be trained under 108. But I think right now it's overly emphasized on, hey, we've got these wonderful autonomous systems. And I think, again, there are certain ones where that's easy. But yeah, relevant today, even drone delivery is not as simple as people might think. And there are these dynamic risks that just pop up out of nowhere.
We talked about that incident that happened again for our listeners and audience. A delivery drone, a couple of delivery drones ran into a crane that was erected doing some construction along the flight paths. Now, the individual who was monitoring those aircraft, because they're highly autonomous, that's where that air sense would come in good, where they're managing and responding to a significant critical incident. And doing that efficiently and safely is important, and having that knowledge base to go back on is important. And I don't know if and I know we have some very bright high school students that you've educated, but taking a high school student and putting them into a highly complex delivery operations, one to many, I don't know if they have those skill sets from day one. And so that's where we have to just continue to think about training and what proficiency looks like. Not just you're qualified, but are you proficient? And that's super important. What about Cyberhawk? Are you guys looking for pilots? Are you looking for hiring additional folks? What do you look for, and what's the critical mix there that you guys are looking for?
We've been hiring a few pilots basically every week for the past few months. It ebbs and flows with the scope. January is usually, December is really the hiring time where we kind of re-up for our contracts for the next year, where we have that big push. About a year and a half ago, we pushed away from 1099. All of our pilots are W-2. That allows the money for training that's spent on training to kind of stay within the company longer, on average at least. When it's seasonal pilots, you kind of go where the work is. So it's tough to make that case to a CFO and be like, hey, let's spend $70,000 and get these guys trained up so they're ace pilots. We're always looking, I say this, like throw in a resume, it doesn't hurt. And, a lot of the times it just depends on new contracts and scope reward, or kind of the new season. January is that reset. What we're looking for, stick time is great. Have it documented, even if you've never flown for somebody else, keep a log. It doesn't have to be aired.
I always encourage people that, like, even if you're out there flying recreational, hey, log 1.2 hours recreational, it's important. And So for our listeners, Cyberhawk, go to the website. Can you tell us what you're...
Yeah. www.thecyberhawk.com. And there should be a contact information page there. Again, we have our roles listed there, and, we're hiring not just pilots, by the way. This is another thing. The industry is larger than that. We have planners, we have project managers, we have customer solutions, we have computer programmers for our software suite, iHawk. So there's a lot of things you can do in the drone industry that don't necessarily need to be a field pilot. Again, happiest part of my day is when I do get to fly. But I deal a lot of paperwork. You do something like
As most managers do.
and deal with the FAA calling you. Like I said, I had 3 calls today from different FSDOs and ATCs and dealing with that. Which again, I'm weird. I take pleasure out of that. I like it. I think the biggest thing is throw it out there. Count your hours. Log them. Yeah, even if you're flying for yourself, log them. Like I said, I don't hold it against a pilot if they have very few hours. In fact, sometimes, not always, but sometimes the pilots with the 4,000 hours are very set in their way, and it's hard to retrain them the way that you want to fly. And somebody who comes in and knows like, hey, I don't know what I don't know, they're kind of a blank slate. And oftentimes that can be easier they don't have the bad habits yet. And you can coach them up. I think also, there's lots of opportunities if you're just trying to get in there. Look at the RADs, look at the drone network providers, where you can pick up some paid jobs. And hey, like if you're paid, you're a commercial pilot, right? It may not be making millions of dollars, but you start building it up, and that's going to build up your confidence too. And you'll figure out what you like to do, and what you're good at. There's flying distribution poles is a high stress environment where the chance of hitting something is super high. Flying agriculture, while there's still chances to do that, is less about the mode 2 flying and more about learning the softwares and programming the flights. So there's a wide gamut of even in the company that I work, there's a wide way of how we approach different aspects. A LiDAR mission is completely different from a close visual inspection in terms of how we approach it, the team that's there. But you'll start to gravitate towards what you like, and you might find, hey, precision agriculture, power washing is huge, and I think will continue to grow. And there's lots of benefits there from reducing water expenses, reducing runoff, and things like that the farmers love. And it's just super cool to fly a drone for work.
No, I agree with you. I've been in the drone delivery side of the house for a decade now, and recently, joined USI, and we're really excited about our training and even more so about our consultation opportunities, where we're able to help small companies and even large companies go to that next step, especially in preparation for 108. Scott, it's been awesome chatting with you. I may not see eye to eye as a Red Sox fan, but I'm a Mets fan, so that means one thing. That means one thing. That's right. That's right. That means we can be frenemies, and we can definitely align against the horrible Yankee. I don't even want to say the name.
Yeah, we don't talk about pinstripes here. Okay? Yeah.
So it was great talking to you. It was good catching up. Thank you for your time today, and I think that's all we have on today's episode. And it was great seeing you again.
Yes, sir. Matt, thanks so much for having me. It was wonderful talking with you.
Thanks, Scott. I really, really appreciate you joining us today. Great conversation on return on investment and how safety is the baseline consideration for all things waivers and beyond. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Go Mets next year. Bye for now.